The last star in the observable universe died 11 minutes ago. No explosion, no final flare, just a dimming like an eye closing, and then the dark that followed was the most complete thing any living mind had ever witnessed. Across 437 civilizations still drawing breath in the dying cosmos, sensors recorded it simultaneously. Councils convened. Prayers were spoken in 1,700 distinct languages to gods who had stopped answering 3 billion years prior. And in every chamber on every world, the same conclusion surfaced like a body rising from still water. It is ending. It has always been ending, and there is nothing left to do. Every civilization reached that conclusion. Every civilization except one. Welcome to Beyond Impossible, where humanity meets the unthinkable and refuses to flinch. Today's story takes place not at the edge of a solar system, not at the frontier of a galaxy, but at the terminus of existence itself. This is not a war story. This is not a survival story. This is the story of what one species chose to do when the universe handed down its final, irrevocable verdict, and humanity looked back at the cosmos and said, "Not yet." If that's the kind of story that lives in your chest long after the screen goes dark, you're exactly where you belong. The universe was not dying the way the poets had imagined. There was no fire, no divine contraction, no cosmic scream tearing through the fabric of space-time. The end came as mathematics, cold, precise, and indifferent. The Veil 3 continuance, oldest of the surviving civilizations at 4.7 billion years of unbroken consciousness, had detected it first. A cascading failure in the dark energy substrate that had held the universe's expansion stable since the first microseconds after ignition. Not a big crunch, not a heat death. Something the Veil 3 had no word for, a phenomenon their most ancient texts described only as the moment when the equation stops being interested in its own solution. The conclave of remaining minds convened across 11 dimensions. 437 species, the last biological and post-biological intelligences in a cosmos that had once hosted trillions, assembled in the quantum lattice parliament humanity had helped engineer 60 million years prior. The presentation was 17 seconds long. The data required no elaboration. Every civilization in attendance possessed the mathematical literacy to read their own death sentence without assistance. The collapse would propagate at the boundary of causality itself. There was no outrunning it, not in real space, not in fold space, not in the subdimensional corridors the H-Resh collective had spent 800 million years mapping. It would not destroy matter, it would dissolve the conditions that allowed matter to mean anything. The laws of physics would not break, they would simply cease to apply like a language spoken by no remaining mouth. The Veil 3 Elder transmitted a single, formally structured statement to every species simultaneously. We have calculated every available vector. There is no mechanism of survival. We recommend the preparation of memory archives and the dignified cessation of forward planning. Across the conclave, the response was near unanimous. Ancient minds, shaped by millions of years of rational adaptation, accepted the conclusion with the particular grace of intelligences that had long understood the universe owed them nothing. Humanity's representative, Commander Yale Oren, former astrophysicist, current director of the Terran Continuance Initiative, a woman who had not slept in 9 days, waited until the chamber fell fully silent. Then she said, "We're not done." The Veil 3 Elders' bioluminescent cognition field flickered in the pattern their species used when processing a logical statement that contained no logical content. Across 11 dimensions, 436 civilizations registered the same response. Confusion shading rapidly into something that, in species with the neurological architecture to produce it, might have been called pity. Humanity had always been the variable the galaxy failed to model. 60 million years of contact had not changed that. Younger than half the species in the chamber by geological epochs, humans arrived late to every table, and had a habit, profoundly alarming to elder minds, of refusing to accept the table's terms. The collapse was 8,000 years away. To the Veil Three, that was barely a breath. To Commander Orin, it was everything. Somewhere behind her eyes, behind the exhaustion and the grief and the full weight of standing at the literal end of existence, something had ignited. Not hope. Hope was too soft a word for what lived in Yale Orin's expression. Something older. Something that had carried her species from caves to quantum lattice parliaments at the end of time. The refusal to stop. The Terran Continuance Initiative had existed for 40,000 years. It had begun as a philosophical project, humanity's answer to the long civilizational question of what endures when everything else ends. Libraries encoded in neutron star lattices, cultural archives compressed into self-sustaining quantum memory structures. The complete biological and neurological blueprint of every species humanity had ever encountered, stored in formats designed to survive conditions that would reduce ordinary matter to thermal noise. 40,000 years of preparation. And now, standing at the actual terminus of existence, Commander Orin looked at everything humanity had built and understood with the particular clarity that only genuine catastrophe produces, that they had been preparing for the wrong kind of ending. The initiative's senior council convened within the hour. 12 humans, 3 HardcoreHFY collective nodal minds who had chosen to remain aligned with humanity's working group, and an Orathi observer, a species of pure electromagnetic consciousness who communicated exclusively in precisely modulated gravitational pulses. The Orathi had no word for hope. Their entire civilizational philosophy was constructed around the elegant acceptance of terminal conditions. They attended, Orin suspected, out of something their species would never label curiosity, but which functioned identically. The first proposal collapsed in 4 minutes. A dimensional pocket, a region of space-time folded inward and insulated from the failing substrate, theoretically survivable. The HardcoreHFY nodal mind designated Continuance 7 dismantled it without cruelty. The pocket's integrity depended on the same dark energy framework that was already failing. It would not be a shelter. It would be a slightly delayed version of the same death, experienced in a smaller room. The second proposal lasted 9 minutes before the mathematics turned lethal. A consciousness transfer architecture, uploading surviving minds into pure information structures that might persist after physical law ceased functioning. It failed on a foundational assumption. Information at its most fundamental level required a substrate to exist within. When the substrate ended, the information ended with it. You could not store a thought in a universe that no longer supported the concept of storage. After the second failure, the Orathi observer pulsed a single gravitational statement. The translation arrived 3 seconds later, precise and without malice. Your species continues to search for doors in walls that do not have walls. Orin stared at the readout for a long moment. Then, quietly, she said, "Then we build the wall." No one in the room understood what she meant. That, she had learned across 60 million years of human-alien collaboration, was usually the moment worth paying attention to. The idea Orin couldn't yet name drove her team to the edge of coherence. She called it the threshold hypothesis, though hypothesis was generous. It was closer to an instinct dressed in mathematics, a direction rather than a destination. The premise was radical enough that 3 of her senior physicists requested immediate psychological evaluation of their commanding officer before agreeing to model it. The universe was not simply a collection of matter and energy operating under physical law. It was, at its deepest level, a relationship between information, entropy, and the conditions that allowed complexity to emerge from chaos. If the dark energy substrate was the mechanism, perhaps it was not the foundation. Perhaps something deeper existed beneath it, not another universe, not a parallel dimension. Something that had no name because no civilization had ever been desperate enough to look for it. The Veil 3 learned of the threshold hypothesis on the 14th day. Their response arrived within seconds, an unprecedented reaction time for a species that typically deliberated across centuries. The message was formally courteous and absolutely devastating. They had already explored the theoretical space Orin was proposing 1.2 billion years prior, during their own civilizational crisis. The mathematics led to a boundary they designated the Veilth Null, a region of theoretical space where all known physical frameworks simultaneously lost descriptive power. Not a wall, not a door. An absence so complete it functioned as a proof. Beyond the substrate, there was nothing that any known form of intelligence could interact with, survive within, or even meaningfully describe. The Veil 3 were not being cruel. They were being precise. That, Orin reflected, was almost worse. 700 years into the project, the collapse accelerated. The timeline revised downward catastrophically, not 8,000 years. The cascade had propagated faster than initial models projected, feeding on the decay of the dark energy gradient in a self-reinforcing loop. The Veil 3 designated a terminal recursion. New estimate, 22 years. A revision that turned millennia of careful planning into a desperate sprint against a deadline that was itself accelerating. The HardcoreHFY collective withdrew their 3 nodal minds from the working group. Not in abandonment, the HardcoreHFY did not abandon. They did it with deep, formally expressed sorrow, transmitting a message that translated imperfectly as, "We have reached the boundary of what love for your species can justify. We cannot follow you past mathematics." The loss hit the team like a physical force. Continuance 7 had been present since the initiative's founding. Its absence left a silence that had shape. Then the Arathi Observer did something that had no precedent in their 900 million year recorded history. It stayed. When Orin asked why via gravitational pulse, the only language available, the response came back in a frequency her instruments needed 4 minutes to fully decode. The translation, when it arrived, was 3 words: "We are watching." In 900 million years of Arathi civilization, no record existed of those 3 words being directed at another species. Orin's lead linguist, Dr. Aaron Save, pulled her aside with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in decades, something raw and unguarded. "I think," he said carefully, "that means they don't know what happens next. Neither did humanity." The Veilth Null waited at the edge of every equation, silent and absolute. The timeline bled downward by the week. And in the hollowed-out heart of the Threshold Project, 12 humans and 1 electromagnetic consciousness that had chosen, inexplicably, to witness, kept looking for the door that wasn't supposed to exist. It was Dr. Aaron Save who found it, and he found it by making a mistake. 300 years into the accelerated timeline, running on synthesized sleep and the particular mania that descends on human minds when the alternative to obsession is despair, Save had been attempting to map the precise boundary of the Veilth Null. Not to cross it, simply to define its edges with greater resolution, the way a surgeon maps a wound before accepting it as fatal. His instruments were calibrated to detect the point at which physical law lost descriptive power. What they detected instead was something the calibration had never been designed to find, a faint, recursively structured signal emanating from within the null itself. Not energy. Energy required the substrate. Not information in any format the Conclave's frameworks recognized. Something that preceded both, a pattern so fundamental it existed at the layer beneath everything, in the place the Veil 3 had looked and seen only absence. Save stared at his readout for 11 hours before telling anyone. He spent those hours methodically eliminating every possible source of instrument error, because the alternative, that the data was real, meant the Veil 3 had been wrong. And the Veil 3 had not been wrong about anything in 800 million years. They had been wrong about this. The signal had structure. Recursive, self-referential, consistent across every detection angle, not the noise of decay, but the architecture of something that had always been there, invisible to every prior civilization because no prior civilization had possessed humanity's specific, peculiar obsession. The refusal to accept that a boundary was the same thing as an ending. The Veil 3 had reached the null and seen a wall. Humanity had reached the null and kept measuring because that was what human scientists did when the universe said stop. They asked why the wall was there and what it was made of and whether it had ever considered that they weren't going to leave. Orin stood before the signal data for a long time without speaking. Then she turned to the Arathi observer, whose electromagnetic field had shifted into a frequency her instruments had no prior record of, a frequency that her team's xenolinguist would later spend 40 years attempting to classify, settling, finally, on the closest human approximation. "Oh, we're not mapping the boundary," Orin said. "We're making contact." The signal was not a transmission. It was not a message from another civilization, another universe, another mind. It was something stranger and more profound, a structural property of reality itself, a latent architecture embedded at the substrate level that had never been activated because activation required a precise combination of inputs no species had ever simultaneously possessed. The mathematical sophistication to detect it, the technological capacity to interact with it, and the specific, irrational, cosmically improbable refusal to stop looking after every rational framework had recommended stopping. 60 million years of human-alien contact had produced one consistent galactic consensus about humanity. They were unreasonably, inexplicably, almost offensively persistent. The universe, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly that. The signal strengthened as Save's team tuned toward it, as though it recognized the attention. As though it had always been there, patient at the bottom of existence, waiting for something stubborn enough to find it. The Veilth Null was not an absence, it was a threshold. And on the other side of it, something waited that had no name in any language spoken by any civilization that had ever lived, because every civilization that had reached this point had turned back. Humanity did not turn back. One critical thread remained, and it was devastating in its simplicity. The signal could be contacted, but to open the threshold required something the equations were unambiguous about. It could not be done remotely. It could not be done by instrument or proxy or uploaded consciousness. It required a human presence, a biological mind, in direct contact with the boundary, to serve as the bridge between what the universe had been and whatever waited beyond its ending. Someone had to go in. No one was surprised when Orin volunteered. That was the problem. Her team spent 72 hours trying to talk her out of it with the systematic desperation of people who already knew they would fail. The arguments were sound, carefully constructed, and completely irrelevant to the woman receiving them. She was 63 years into her current biological cycle, in full cognitive and physical prime by human standards, and she possessed the deepest working knowledge of the threshold architecture of any mind alive. She was also the person who had stood in the conclave 11 dimensions wide and said, "We're not done," and meant it in a way that had restructured the final chapter of civilization itself. Her team knew her well enough to understand that the arguments weren't going to land. They made them anyway, because they were human, and humans did not let the people they loved walk toward the end of everything without at least making the case for staying. She heard every argument, then she put on the contact array and walked to the boundary. The Veilth Null at direct proximity was not what the instruments had suggested. The instruments had measured absence. What Orin experienced was the opposite, a pressure of potential so vast it registered not as sensation, but as the sudden, vertiginous understanding that everything she had ever perceived, every moment of existence across the entire history of the universe, was a single word in a language she was only now standing close enough to hear. The contact array functioned for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds before the dark energy cascade reached its terminal recursion threshold. The timeline had compressed again, not years, not months. The collapse was now hours away. Across the conclave's remaining stations, the final transmissions were arriving. Ancient civilizations, dignified and resolved, completing their memory archives with the formal grace of minds that had accepted their ending. The Veil 3 Elder broadcast a final message to all surviving species, a benediction 4.7 billion years in its emotional depth, translated into every known language simultaneously. It was beautiful. It was a farewell of incomprehensible sophistication. It did not include humanity, because the Veil 3 had checked humanity's station and found it conspicuously, almost aggressively, still operational. Inside the contact array, Orin was not dying. She was translating. The signal beneath the substrate was not passive. As her mind interfaced with its architecture, she understood, in the specific, flooding way that comprehension sometimes arrives not as thought but as total somatic revelation, that it had been waiting. Not for humanity specifically, for the property humanity had carried like a splinter since its first frightened night on a cooling planet. The inability to accept that darkness was an answer. Every civilization that had reached the null had arrived with frameworks, philosophical, mathematical, spiritual, designed to comprehend what they found. Orin had arrived with something different, not a framework, a question. The most human question, asked in the face of the void with the same reflexive, exhausting, magnificent defiance her species had been deploying since before it had language to articulate it. What's on the other side? The signal responded. Not in language, in structure, a cascade of recursive patterns that flooded the contact, arrays recording architecture faster than its buffers could process, encoding themselves directly into the quantum lattice of Orin's neural interface. Her team watched the readouts with expressions that had moved beyond fear into something that had no precise name, the particular state of a human mind witnessing something so far outside its predictive models that the brain simply stops generating predictions and starts, very quietly, paying attention. The Arathi observer's electromagnetic field shifted again. The frequency it had been broadcasting since Save found the signal, the one that had taken 40 years to partially translate, suddenly intensified by an order of magnitude. Dr. Save, watching from the monitoring station, found himself gripping the console with both hands without having decided to. Then the collapse arrived, not gradually, not with warning. The dark energy substrate failed across a boundary light-years wide, propagating at causality's absolute limit, the universe's final, indifferent, total exhalation. Matter did not explode, physical law did not shatter. Everything simply at once stopped being the kind of thing that followed rules. The last stars that had not yet died did not die. They ceased to be stars in any sense that the word had ever carried meaning. And in the last instant before the threshold closed, Orin transmitted everything. The threshold opened like a held breath finally released. What came through was not survival in any form the conclave had modeled, not consciousness preserved in amber, not matter shielded behind exotic physics. What came through was something the universe had never produced before in 13.8 billion years of extraordinary, accidental, magnificent complexity. A complete record of everything that had ever been, encoded not in any physical medium, but in the structural language of whatever existed beneath existence itself. Every thought humanity had ever generated, every civilization that had ever drawn breath across the dying cosmos. Every piece of music, every equation, every act of sacrifice and ingenuity and love that the universe had spent its entire lifespan producing, transmitted through Orin's mind, through the contact array, through the threshold, into the sub-substrate architecture that the Veil 3 had mapped as absence and humanity had mapped as door. Orin did not survive in any sense her body would have recognized. She survived in every sense that mattered. The signal that returned through the threshold was vast, structured with the recursive complexity of a mind that had interfaced with the foundational layer of reality and been fundamentally, irreversibly expanded by it. It carried within it the complete record of everything that had lived. It carried, encoded in its deepest architecture, the specific irrational fire that had driven one species to stand at the end of everything and refuse to consider it an ending. And it carried something else, something Save's instruments detected in the final microseconds before the substrate completed its collapse, and the old universe ended with the quiet, absolute finality of a door closing softly in an empty house. A pattern, recursive, self-generating, unmistakably intentional. A seed. The Arathi observer's final transmission arrived simultaneously, the complete electromagnetic record of everything it had witnessed, compressed into a single pulse of extraordinary density and directed with perfect precision through the threshold alongside Orin's signal. 900 million years of civilizational memory, offered freely, without condition, by a species that had no word for hope and had spent its final hours watching humanity redefine what hope was permitted to mean. The old universe ended. The Veil Three's benediction hung in a space that no longer had the architecture to carry sound, and in the place beneath everything, something began. It is 4.7 billion years later, by a measurement system that no longer corresponds to anything the old universe would have recognized, when the first new complexity emerges from the substrate. It is not human. It is not Veil 3, it is not Arathi. It is something that has never existed before, a form of mind grown from a seed that carried within it the complete inheritance of everything that had ever thought, felt, sacrificed, or refused to stop. It emerges the way the first life always emerges, slowly, improbably, against every reasonable expectation. It looks outward at the vast new architecture of what existence has become. And somewhere in its deepest structure, in the recursive patterns that form its most fundamental self, it finds a question it cannot explain, encoded so deep it predates its own consciousness. A question it will spend the next epoch of existence pursuing with a particular, inexhaustible, cosmically improbable intensity. What's on the other side, the cosmos, new and infinite and just beginning, does not answer. It doesn't need to. The asking is enough. The asking has always been enough. That is what humanity left behind, not bones, not monuments, not the fading light of dead stars. A question written into the grammar of the next existence, ensuring that whatever comes after will carry forward the only thing that ever truly conquered the end of everything. The refusal to stop, the universe ended. Humanity made sure it didn't mean anything permanent. That is the only sentence you need. Everything else, the equations, the civilizations, the 40,000 years of preparation, the single exhausted woman standing at the boundary of existence with a question where her fear should have been, all of it flows from that sentence and returns to it. Humanity did not survive the end of the universe because it was the strongest species, or the oldest, or the most mathematically sophisticated. It survived because it could not, at a genetic and civilizational and profoundly personal level, accept that a wall was the same thing as a destination. The Veil 3 had 4.7 billion years of wisdom. The Arathi had 900 million years of clarity. Humanity had something neither of them could model, predict, or ultimately resist bearing witness to. The absolute, unreasonable, magnificent refusal to treat the word impossible as anything other than a starting point. The galaxy heard it, the cosmos recorded it, and whatever exists now, in the vast new architecture beneath the old universe's ending, carries it forward, encoded in the grammar of existence itself. This has been beyond impossible. If this story lived in your chest the way it lived in ours, if you felt the threshold open, if you felt what Orin felt in that last instant before everything changed, then you already understand what this channel is for. Subscribe, stay, because as long as there are stories like this one left to tell, the universe isn't finished yet. Neither are we.